Imagine trying to survive winter with no heating, little food, and a house full of smoke. Now imagine doing it not for one difficult evening, but for weeks, and then for months, while frost gathered along the edges of the world outside, while the wind pressed against the walls, and while every meal, every ember, and every scrap of cloth mattered more than it had the day before. Tonight, we are stepping quietly into the winter world of medieval peasants. Not kings in great halls, not nobles wrapped in fur beside roaring fireplaces, but ordinary people, families in small homes, villagers who lived close to the earth, close to hunger, close to cold, and close to one another. In this slow journey, we will look at how they prepared for winter, how they faced the dark, how they stretched food, how they protected warmth, and how they endured a season that could punish every weakness in the household. If you enjoy calm history told in a way that helps you rest, welcome to Pillow History. Winter did not arrive all at once for a medieval peasant family. It came gradually. First through the light. Days shortened. Mornings grew dim and sharp. Even before the first real frost, the village would already feel different. The paths became heavier. The air became thinner and colder. The open fields, once full of movement, slowly lost their energy. A peasant family would notice these changes in ways that were deeply practical. The sun disappeared earlier. Water bit harder at the hands. Dampness lingered longer. Clothing dried more slowly. Wood had to be watched. Grain had to be counted. Small weaknesses in the house became easier to notice, because the season ahead would magnify them. For medieval peasants, winter was not simply a colder time of year. It was a test. A test of preparation, of patience, of storage, of habit, of memory, and sometimes of luck. If a family had gathered too little firewood, winter would reveal it. If the roof leaked, winter would reveal it. If an animal had grown weak before the season turned, winter would reveal it. If food stores were smaller than hoped, winter would reveal that too, and it would do so slowly, day after day, with quiet persistence. That is one of the clearest truths of pre-modern life. Nature did not need to be dramatic to be severe. A storm could be dangerous, yes, but a long season of ordinary cold could be just as cruel. Not through sudden destruction, but through wearing people down. Through dampness. Through repetition. Through the slow shrinking of comfort. And yet winter was not only fear. It also brought a different rhythm. The fields no longer demanded the same frantic labor they did in spring or harvest. The landscape narrowed. Life drew inward. The home, the fire, the store of grain, the condition of the roof, the strength of the animals, the warmth of clothing, and the closeness of family all became more important than ever. Imagine the village at the edge of winter. Bare trees standing against a pale sky. Mud stiffening in the road. Thin smoke rising from low roofs. A dog moving across the yard. A cartwheel leaving dark tracks in the ground. A woman carrying kindling. A man checking the woodpile. Children moving in short bursts through the cold before being called back inside. Nothing dramatic. And yet everything quietly preparing for endurance. That is how medieval peasants entered winter. Not with romance, and not with comfort, but with attention. They had to think ahead because winter gave very little in return. Once the season settled in, there would be fewer chances to correct mistakes. A household that had prepared well might still suffer, but it had a chance. A household that had prepared badly would feel every forgotten task, every weak wall, every empty space in the storehouse. The peasant year was built around this truth. Spring and summer were not only seasons of growth, they were seasons of future survival. What was gathered in warmer months had to reach into the cold. What was repaired before frost had to hold through the dark. What was preserved in autumn had to remain useful long after the fields had fallen silent. This is why winter feels so powerful when we look back at peasant life. It stripped existence down to essentials: warmth, food, shelter, cloth, fire, family, endurance. A person did not need luxury to understand winter. They needed enough. Enough wood, enough grain, enough dry bedding, enough strength, enough luck to avoid illness, accident, or a season that stretched longer than the household could bear. And for many peasants, enough was always uncertain. The modern world hides many of these uncertainties from us. We flick a switch for light. We turn a dial for heat. We buy food without seeing the months of weather behind it. But in a medieval village, the chain between nature and survival remained painfully visible. Every cold morning reminded people where they stood inside that chain. When the first real frost came, it would sharpen everything. The ground changed texture. Roofs whitened in the early light. The breath of people and animals became visible. Water stiffened. Sounds carried differently through the air. Doors opened to colder rooms. Hands reached first for cloaks, for shawls, for the habit of staying near warmth whenever possible. Inside the home, the mood changed too. The hearth mattered more. Shadows came earlier. The useful part of the day felt shorter. Tasks had to be pulled closer to the fire, closer to the remaining light, closer to the center of the house. Even the sound of the house changed in winter. More creaking wood. More crackling fire. More quiet voices. More coughing. More pauses. There is a temptation to imagine medieval village life as picturesque in winter. Snow on roofs. Firelight at windows. The beauty of silence. And yes, there was beauty. But for peasants, beauty was never the whole story. That same snow meant cold feet, wet paths, harder journeys, more pressure on stored food, and more dependence on a house that might be drafty, smoky, or damp. Winter was beautiful only from a distance. From inside it, winter was work. The arrival of winter also changed the emotional map of the household. People drew closer together physically, and that closeness could mean warmth, support, irritation, fatigue, or all of these at once. The room felt smaller. The air felt heavier. The same faces were seen under the same dim light, day after day, while the outside world became narrower and less inviting. And yet, this closeness was part of survival. Medieval peasant life was not built on personal space. It was built on shared space. Shared labor. Shared meals. Shared discomfort. Shared sleep. Shared responsibility. In winter, those things became even more obvious. A household did not endure because each person solved the season alone. It endured because everyone, in one way or another, helped the small domestic system continue. The village itself also changed as winter deepened. There were fewer casual movements, fewer unnecessary tasks outdoors, fewer moments of open comfort. Smoke from roofs became one of the clearest signs of life. As long as smoke rose, people inside were still heating, still cooking, still making the season bearable. A roof without smoke might invite worry. A path without footprints might seem lonelier. Winter made absence more visible. And it made sound more important. The bark of a dog at dusk. The sound of wood being chopped. The movement of geese or pigs. The knock at a door. The low murmur of neighbors exchanging some small necessity. The bell from a distant church, softened by fog or snow. These sounds told people that village life was continuing, even under strain. This is one reason winter stories remain so compelling. They reduce life to what matters most. They reveal how ordinary people survived not through grandeur, but through repetition. Through keeping a fire alive. Through stretching one more sack of grain. Through carrying one more bundle of wood. Through patching a cloak instead of replacing it. Through noticing what was still enough, and hoping that enough would continue a little longer. As winter settled more firmly over the land, peasants would begin to feel the season not just around them, but inside their routine. The day opened later. The evening arrived sooner. The body moved differently in the cold. Hands stiffened. Faces tightened. Hunger could sharpen faster in cold weather, and warmth became something to seek repeatedly, not something taken for granted. The fields outside no longer offered the same promise they had in greener months. Instead, they became reminders of distance. Frozen ground. Bare hedges. Empty stretches of earth waiting for another cycle. The land had not disappeared, but it had become less generous, less immediate, and less forgiving. What mattered now was not what might grow. What mattered was what had already been stored, repaired, dried, salted, stacked, or saved. That shift, from growth to endurance, was the true beginning of peasant winter. And so the season closed around the village, quietly at first. A colder dawn. A darker afternoon. A slower evening. Then another. And another. Until winter was no longer approaching. It had arrived, and the household had to live inside it. In the next part of our journey, we will step inside the peasant house itself, into the one-room world of smoke, fire, rough shelter, and the small practical decisions that made cold weather survivable. Now let us step inside the peasant house itself. A medieval peasant house was not built to impress anyone. It was built, as best as possible, to hold together. For most villagers, the home was small, simple, and practical. Timber, clay, wattle and daub, rough thatch, and an earthen floor formed the basic world of daily life. These materials came from the local landscape. Nothing about the house was extravagant. Every part of it belonged to necessity. And in winter, necessity became even more visible. The house did not shut winter out. It resisted winter, slowly and imperfectly. Wind still found its way through weak points. Dampness still settled into corners. The floor could remain cold. Wet shoes, wet hems, and damp straw made the indoors feel heavier than we might imagine. A house that stayed even partly dry was valuable. A house that held warmth even a little longer was a blessing. To modern eyes, such a room would seem dark, cramped, smoky, and uncomfortable. And often it was. But to the peasant family, this space was not judged by beauty. It was judged by whether it worked. Did the roof hold? Did the walls stand? Did the fire stay alive? Did the room protect the family well enough to make the season survivable? At the center of the room stood the hearth. The hearth was not only a source of warmth, it was the center of winter life. It gave heat, light, cooked food, dried clothing, warmed hands, and made the dark more bearable. Without the fire, a peasant house in winter would feel far harsher, far more silent, and far more dangerous. And yet the hearth brought a problem of its own: smoke. This is one of the most important things to understand about the winter life of medieval peasants. Their homes were often smoky, not in every moment to the same degree, and not always unbearable, but smoky enough that the air itself felt different from the air of a modern home. Smoke would drift upward, gather beneath the rafters, darken beams, cling to clothing, and become part of the smell of daily life. Hair would smell of smoke. Wool would smell of smoke. Blankets would hold the scent of smoke. The room itself would be marked by it. To us, that sounds exhausting. And often it probably was. But smoke also belonged to survival. It was the cost of heat. A better built house might guide smoke more effectively. A higher roof might help. A smoke hole or vent might reduce the worst of it. But for ordinary villagers, perfect air was not the goal. Warmth was the goal. Dryness was the goal. Endurance was the goal. The fire itself had to be managed carefully. Fuel was never abstract. A woodpile was a measure of future safety. Every log mattered. Every bundle of sticks mattered. To burn too much too early meant risk later. To burn too little meant more immediate cold. Medieval peasant life required judgment in small things, again and again, and the hearth was one of the clearest examples of that. A family had to think about embers, not just flames. Keeping a fire alive or at least preserving enough warmth to restart it more easily mattered in ways that are easy for us to overlook. Fire was not as easy as pressing a button or turning a dial. It had to be sustained, protected, watched. This also changed the rhythm of the room. People moved toward the fire. Work moved toward the fire. Evening meals happened near the fire. Mending happened near the fire. Waiting happened near the fire. Silence itself gathered near the fire. In winter, the warmest places in the house were not equal, and everyone knew it. A step or two closer to the hearth could make a real difference. That meant the house was divided less by walls and more by temperature. Near the hearth, the room was warmer. Near the edges, colder. High under the roof, smokier. Near the floor, damper. The peasant home was not one single comfort level. It was a collection of tolerable zones. And still, within all of that, life continued. A pot might hang over the flame. Damp wool might be drying. Straw might lie in the corner for bedding. A cloak might hang nearby. Some small food store might sit against a wall. A stool, a rough table, a few tools, a wooden bowl, a bench. The room held very little by modern standards, but everything in it had purpose. That purpose gave the house its dignity. The peasant home was not grand. It was not elegant. But in winter, it became the thin boundary between the family and the season outside. Within its smoky, dim interior, ordinary people built a form of survival from very modest things. A patch of warmth, a little light, a pot of food, a place to sit, a place to sleep, a fire that still held. This was enough, sometimes only just enough, but enough to carry a household through another cold evening. And perhaps that is the clearest image of all. Not comfort in the modern sense, but a small room, rough and dark, with firelight moving across timber and smoke drifting overhead, while outside the winter pressed against the walls and the family remained inside, close to warmth, close to one another, and close to the fragile systems that made survival possible. In the next part of our journey, we will move deeper into winter life itself, into food, storage, and the slow arithmetic of making supplies last. By winter, the question was no longer what is growing. The question was what remains. For medieval peasants, winter food was built around storage, preservation, and caution. The fresh abundance of warmer months had already passed. What mattered now was what had been dried, salted, hung, stored, or protected well enough to survive the season. Grain mattered. Beans and peas mattered. Root vegetables mattered. Onions mattered. Animal fat mattered. And if a household had managed to preserve meat, even a small amount of it could make a real difference. Winter narrowed the diet. Meals were often simple, repetitive, and practical. This was not a season of endless variety. It was a season of calculation. How much grain remained? How much could be spared? How long would the stores last? Could a little salt meat be used now, or should it be saved? Was it better to make the pot thicker today, or thinner, so that food would stretch farther tomorrow? That quiet arithmetic shaped the whole household. One of the most familiar winter foods was pottage, a thick and practical mixture made from whatever the family had available. Grain, peas, beans, onions, cabbage, roots, perhaps a little fat, perhaps a little preserved meat if fortune allowed it. It was not glamorous food, but it was useful food. Warm food. Filling food. The kind of food that kept people moving through cold weather. A pot near the fire was more than a meal. It was reassurance. To come back from the cold and find warmth in the room and something hot in the pot was one of the small ways a household knew it was still holding together. The flavors may have been plain, the variety limited, but heat itself mattered. A warm bowl could soften the edge of the day. It could restore some strength. It could make the next hour more manageable. Bread also remained central, though not all bread was equal. Fine white bread was not the bread of ordinary peasants. More often, bread was darker, rougher, and made from whatever grain was available locally. Bread was not only food. It was structure. It sat beside the pot, beside the fire, beside the rhythm of the house itself. And then there was preservation. Autumn labor had to reach into winter. Meat, especially if pigs had been slaughtered before the hardest part of the season, might be salted or smoked. Little could be wasted. What could be preserved had to be preserved. What could be stretched had to be stretched. Fat, too, was precious. A little fat changed a meal. It changed how long warmth stayed in the body. It changed how satisfying plain food could feel. This was one of the hidden truths of winter life. Hunger was not always dramatic. Often it was gradual. It was the sense that meals had become smaller, thinner, plainer. It was the worry that a sack was emptying faster than it should. It was the silent habit of looking at stores and calculating time. The room itself held signs of this economy. Hanging foods. Small jars. Sacks of grain if the household was fortunate enough to have them. A shelf. A hook. A corner where practical things were kept because they might be needed later. Winter made every stored thing feel more important. And clothing mattered almost as much as food. The cold was not only outside. It remained in the walls, in the floor, in the air near the edges of the room, in the morning before the fire had fully strengthened, in the dark spaces of the house where warmth did not linger. Medieval peasants did not have specialized winter clothing in the modern sense. What they had were layers, wool, cloaks, head coverings, and the habit of making garments last. A cloak mattered. A hood mattered. Dryness mattered. A garment that still blocked the wind mattered. Winter turned ordinary clothing into survival equipment. This is why mending was so important. A tear was not a small cosmetic problem. It was a weakness. A place where cold could enter more easily. So by the hearth, in the dim light, Clothing was patched, strengthened, reused, altered, handed down, and preserved. Fabric had value. Wool had value. Even worn clothing had value, because replacing anything was far harder than repairing it. A cloak drying near the fire was part of winter life. Damp hems, rough wool, the smell of smoke, the stiffness of cold fabric slowly softening in warmth. These were ordinary details, but they mattered. Medieval winter was not survived by grand solutions. It was survived by small materials holding up one more day. Hands, feet, head, and shoulders all needed protection. A body that lost heat too quickly also lost strength too quickly. And strength, in winter, was never something to waste. There is something deeply human in this world of limited things. A rough bowl, a dark loaf, a pot of pottage, a patched cloak, a hood pulled low, a wool blanket. None of these are luxurious objects, but together they form a kind of modest defense against the season. The peasant household did not seek comfort as we understand it. It sought enough. Enough food to continue. Enough warmth to remain functional. Enough cloth to hold the body together against the cold. Enough order in the room that tomorrow could still be faced. And so winter life became narrower, but also more focused. The house, the fire, the stores, the clothing, the condition of the body. These things became the center of thought. Outside, the season was large and unforgiving. Inside, survival depended on the management of very small things. In the next part of our journey, we will move closer to the hardest part of the season itself, to sleep, family closeness, and the quiet labor that continued even after darkness had already fallen. Night was often the hardest part of winter. Day at least brought movement. Movement could warm the body. Work could distract the mind. A person could stay near the fire, carry wood, mend cloth, stir the pot, or tend to some small task that kept the cold from becoming the only thing they felt. But night was different. Night meant stillness. And stillness allowed the cold to come closer. So how did medieval peasants sleep through winter? Not in comfort as we would understand it. Beds, where they existed in stronger form, were valuable possessions. But for many peasants, sleeping arrangements were simple, shared, and practical. Straw bedding, coarse blankets, rough wool, cloaks, and the warmth of other bodies did much of the work. Sleep was not a private luxury. It was part of survival. This is one of the most important things to understand about winter sleep in the medieval peasant household. Warmth pooled where people gathered. Families slept close together because closeness meant heat. Children, especially, might be placed where warmth could be kept more easily. To modern minds, this can sound crowded, inconvenient, or uncomfortable. And often it probably was. But winter did not reward distance. It rewarded shared warmth. The room itself did not become magically warm once people lay down. The fire might have burned lower. Embers might still glow, but much of the house remained cold. Drafts still moved. The floor remained hard and chilly. Smoke might still linger in the darker air above. Bedding had limits. Walls had limits. The night pressed against the house, and the house did only so much to push back. And yet people slept. They slept because they had to. Morning would come, and with it another day of labor, maintenance, carrying, mending, feeding, watching, and enduring. Sleep was not indulgence. It was recovery under poor conditions. A straw bed near dying embers. A rough blanket. A cloak drawn close. The smell of smoke in wool. The sound of wind outside. The quiet shifting of others nearby. This was part of the ordinary texture of medieval winter sleep. It was not peaceful in the modern luxury sense, but it could still become familiar. Human beings adapt to difficult surroundings with surprising strength. And the household adapted too. It learned which part of the room held warmth longer, which bedding stayed driest, which child needed the warmest place, which corner was too damp, which blanket could be spared, which cloak still blocked enough cold to matter. These small decisions shaped the quality of the night. The emotional atmosphere of winter sleep must also have been different from ours. Darkness lasted longer. The house settled into quieter sounds. Outside, the village was less active. A dog barking, a gate shifting, an animal moving in its shelter, the wind against the roof, the soft movement of someone turning in bed, these sounds would have entered the night more clearly. There is a strange intimacy in this kind of history. A family not sleeping beautifully, but sleeping closely. Not enjoying the season, but enduring it together. Not wrapped in comfort, but in enough shared warmth to make the night survivable. And still, even in winter, work did not end. This is another thing modern people often underestimate. Winter changed labor, but it did not remove it. The fields demanded less than they did in planting or harvest, but the household itself still needed constant attention. Tools needed repair. Clothing needed mending. Wood had to be carried. Water still had to be brought. Food still had to be prepared. Spaces still had to be managed. Animals still needed care. Winter work moved inward. Instead of broad movement across the fields, there was closer work. Quieter work. Work done near the hearth, near the table, near the doorway, near the small systems that held the household together. A rough shoe needed fixing. A garment needed patching. A handle needed tightening. A sack needed checking. A rope, a bowl, a stool, a cloak, a knife, a hook. In peasant life, almost everything had to last longer than comfort would prefer. That is why winter evenings were not empty. They were often full of small labor. Not dramatic labor, but sustaining labor. The kind of work that prevented larger problems later. A family that stopped maintaining its household in winter would feel the consequences when spring returned. So cold weather was not simply a pause. It was a season of quieter discipline. This gave the house a different sound after dark. The scrape of a stool on the floor. The pull of thread through cloth. The low crackle of the hearth. The sound of an iron pot shifting. A child being hushed. A quiet voice. A sigh of tiredness. These were not heroic sounds, but they are the sounds of ordinary historical survival. And then, after enough of this, people lay down. The fire dimmed. The room softened into shadow. The useful day had ended. The body, however uncomfortable, yielded to tiredness. Somewhere above, smoke-darkened rafters disappeared into the dark. Somewhere outside, the village slept unevenly. And inside the peasant house, winter remained present, but it did not always win. The family slept. Not perfectly. Not warmly enough by our standards. But enough. Enough to rise again. In the final part of our journey, we will look at animals, hierarchy, and the slow exhaustion of late winter, when the season had already lasted too long and the household had to keep going anyway. Winter did not test only people. It tested animals too. For a medieval peasant household, animals were never separate from survival. They represented food, labor, manure, transport, and future security. A weak animal in winter could become a serious problem. A dead animal could become a disaster. This meant that winter care extended beyond the family itself. It reached into the stable, the yard, the pen, and every small shelter where life had to be preserved until spring. Fodder mattered. Shelter mattered. Daily attention mattered. A household had to think carefully about what could be fed, what could be kept alive, and what might need to be slaughtered before the season became too costly. These were not sentimental decisions. They were practical ones, made in a world where resources had limits. A pig might mean future meat. An ox might mean future field labor. Sheep might mean wool, breeding, or value that stretched beyond the present moment. Winter threatened all of that. It could weaken the animal, weaken the household, and weaken the future at the same time. So peasant winter was not only about feeding people. It was also about preserving the fragile usefulness of animals through cold, hunger, dampness, and exhaustion. And all of this happened within a larger social order. Peasants did not live as fully independent households in the modern sense. Their world was shaped by obligation. Rent, labor, dues, local authority, and the wider structure of the manor or estate framed their lives. Winter hardship did not erase those realities. A family could be cold, tired, and worried about food, while still owing something beyond itself. That made the season heavier. The same cold touched everyone, but not everyone faced it with the same security. A lord did not meet winter in the same way a poor peasant did. Better walls, better stores, better clothing, and more margin for error changed the experience of the season. Winter revealed inequality very clearly. It showed who had reserves, and who lived close to the edge. And yet the peasant household remained the true center of survival. It was in the cottage, by the hearth, beside the grain sack, under the smoky roof, near the rough bedding, and around the winter pot that endurance took shape. Great systems may have structured life from above, but winter was lived from the inside out. Perhaps the hardest part of the season was not its arrival, but its length. Early winter could still feel manageable. Stores were fuller. Energy was stronger. The memory of autumn was still close. But late winter had a different mood. By then the woodpile was lower. Grain had been measured too many times. Meat, if there had ever been much of it, was reduced. Clothing was more worn. The house had been smoky for months. The same darkness, the same floor, the same cold corners, the same routines, all of it became heavier simply because it had lasted so long. This was when winter stopped feeling like an event and became a condition. Late winter carried fatigue of a different kind. The body was tired of being cold. The mind was tired of caution. The household was tired of measuring, saving, repairing, and stretching. The village itself may have looked quieter, not because life had stopped, but because endurance had become slower. This was also the point when mistakes felt larger. A damaged roof patch. A weak animal. A sickness. A spilled store. A few nights of harsher cold. Problems that might once have been manageable now felt more dangerous because reserves had grown smaller. And still, medieval peasants endured. Not beautifully, not comfortably, but steadily. Through habit. Through closeness. Through judgment in small things. Through the discipline of not wasting what remained. Through keeping alive what could still be kept alive. Through getting one more day from one more log, one more meal, one more repaired garment, one more quiet evening near the fire. This is what makes their winter world so powerful to imagine. It was not heroic in a theatrical way. It was ordinary survival under pressure. It was repetition. It was maintenance. It was patience made visible. So how did medieval peasants survive brutal winters? They survived through preparation, through stored food, through patched clothing, through smoke-filled houses that still held enough warmth to matter, through shared sleep, through attention to animals, through quiet labor after dark, through the management of almost everything they owned. And above all, they survived through endurance. Not abundance. Endurance. And as the season slowly loosened its grip, and the thought of spring became imaginable again, the peasant household had not defeated winter in any grand way. It had simply lasted. The roof still held. The fire still burned. The family still remained. The village still breathed smoke into the pale sky. That was enough. And so, as the last light faded over the muddy paths and low cottages of the village, winter remained what it had always been: hard, quiet, and demanding. But inside those rough homes, people kept going. They rested when they could. They shared what warmth they had. They repaired what had worn down. They waited for the season to soften. If you enjoyed this slow journey into the winter life of medieval peasants, subscribe to Pillow History for more peaceful stories from the past. And if you stay with us next time, we will step from the peasant cottage into another cold world entirely, and explore what winter nights felt like inside freezing stone castles. Until then, rest well, and let history grow quiet around you. Thank you for listening to Pillow History. Rest well.